My number 9 best chess game of the 1940s is Zita vs. Bronstein from 1946. This game has been deemed the game that launched modern chess. In fact, the game has a sister, as in round 2 in this tournament, the Prague vs. Moscow tournament, David Bronstein also beat Ludek Pachman with very similar ideas. In this game, in round 6, he unveiled the power of the dark squared bishop in the king's Indian defense. He demonstrated ideas in this game that would inspire a generation such as Mikhail Tal and Bobby Fischer and Gary Kasparov and all others who played the king's Indian defense and other similar modern systems thereafter. Zita opens the game here with pawn to c4, and we will see an unusual move order, but eventually we arrive at a king's Indian defense. That is going to happen after Bronstein plays the move pawn to g6 in this position. Now, at the time, the king's Indian defense was basically thought to be a very passive opening that offered black no real scope for counterplay. However, Bronstein has some new ideas about that. After g6, we see bishop g2 and bishop g7, both players fianchetto, both players castle, and then we get b3, a fianchetto on the other flank, and now rook e8, bishop to b2, and pawn to c6. In fact, a modern player would likely seize on the opportunity to push forward here with pawn to e4, and this probably is a better move. It is a different structure, though. It's basically a King's Indian attack structure, a structure that Bobby Fischer would make famous with the white pieces. Instead, Bronstein is looking to play a more traditional King's Indian defense structure, but it's only more traditional because Bronstein is making it famous and traditional with this game. Now, after c6, we see e4, classic King's Indian defense, 3 pawns in the center for white, and black has the dark squared bishop, which Bronstein now opens up by taking on d4. Knight takes d4, and now probably the best option was knight to c5, putting immediate pressure on e4. In fact, this is more like what Bronstein did against Pachman in round 2. Instead, in this game in round 6, he goes for an immediate queen b6, and the only real problem here is that white can play knight to a4, push the queen back, and undo a little bit of his problems in the position. However, white goes for queen to d2, I guess not wanting to put a knight on the rim where it might be grim, and now Bronstein does sink his knight into c5. There's an immediate attack here on the pawn on e4. Now, this is maybe a good moment to pause and assess a little bit about what Bronstein is up to, what the thinking at the time was, and what the thinking today is. Now, most players would think that white is just better. White has space in the middle of the board. White's space looks very well covered and protected and supported with the bishops, with the knights. Does white really have anything significant in terms of a weakness in this position? Well, white does have a weakness on e4, and this pawn is under attack, but it can be easily defended. Shouldn't white just be better and just squeeze black? However, the reality is much less clear. In fact, the modern computers actually support black in this position. Bronstein likes having the opportunity to put pressure on weak, sensitive points in the white position, including all of the pieces that are piled up here on this long diagonal, including the pawn on e4, and including just generally controlling the dark squares. In fact, this kind of position is one where really white is almost defending here because white is the one who has things that can be attacked. White has space that needs to be held on to, and meanwhile black has enough good squares for the pieces and enough levers in the position to really put pressure on white, and Bronstein demonstrates that beautifully in the game. So white now defends the pawn here on e4, and Bronstein plays one of his lever moves, pawn to a5. He could also consider on this and other moves pawn to h5. He has levers on both sides of the board and the ability to play in interesting fashions on the wings. Meanwhile, what does white have in terms of a plan to make progress in the position? Not much. Now, rook over to b1, sensing the problems on the long diagonal already. Pawn to a4, creating weaknesses and activating this rook here on a8, which hasn't moved but is now exerting pressure. Bishop a1, pawn takes b3, pawn takes b3. This rook now has an open file, and an excellent move here from Bronstein, knight to g4. He opens up his dark squared King's Indian bishop, and now he has pressure on this long diagonal, on the bishop on a1, on the knight here on d4. He's also got pressure against b3, and his queen is putting pressure here against f2. It's all tremendously powerful, and in fact, there is no good move for white. You must make some concessions at this point in the game. At this point, Zita makes the losing move, pawn to h3, trying to evict the knight from g4. A sensible idea, but he's missed Bronstein's next sequence, which he really should have seen because, again, round 2 demonstrates almost the exact same idea. Please check the link in the description for this video to see that particular game. This is an excellent moment to pause your video if you want to find the combination that Bronstein now played. Well, Bronstein plays rook takes a1, giving up his rook for white's dark squared bishop. Now, strategically, this is very interesting, but really, this is more of a tactical sequence here, as at this point, Bronstein is just unleashing a barrage of tactics and destruction here on the white position, and there's no way to hold things together. So after rook takes a1, white must of course recapture. Rook takes a1, and the follow-up here is knight takes f2. And you better have seen this when you sacrifice the rook on a1, otherwise nothing is working. Now, if either capture is made on f2, white just loses. So if queen takes f2, there's just the fork here on d3. You're hitting the queen and the rook, and this knight here on d4, white is losing scads of material. If the king takes on f2 instead, then there's just knight takes b3. You're hitting the queen, you're hitting the rook, and you're on the knight here on d4, and it can't even move to capture on b3 or do anything else. So again, white is losing scads of material. So white cannot capture on f2, which means that Bronstein has already picked up a pawn for the exchange, and Bronstein is threatening here to pick up on b3, potentially to capture on d4, and he's attacking on h3 as well. Everything is under fire. So, for example, in this position, if king h2 to try to defend the h3 pawn, which he loses in the game, then Bronstein can just play knight c to d3. This is attacking the knight here on d4 and the rook on e1, and is a very clean winning move. So, in the game, Zita senses he's not going to be able to hold the pawn on h3, so he plays rook up to e3. And now we do get knight takes h3, picking up another pawn. Bronstein has more than enough material now, and there's more problems coming. King h2 now, and another nice move from Bronstein. Knight back to f2. He just puts the knight on prise again, but Zita still can't capture because if the queen captures on f2, then there's bishop takes d4, immediately regaining the knight, and you've got a pin here, so you're picking up more material. So after knight f2, there's really no way for Zita to save the game, but the finish is also very pleasant. The threat here is knight g4 check, so the rook moves off of the e3 square, rook f3. Now e4 falls, so knight takes e4. Now queen f4, trying to create a threat here against the pawn here on f7. So Bronstein plays knight g4 check, and then just moves the pawn forward, pawn up to f5. Now, Zita's got no really good choices, so he does take on e4, and he takes on d6, but in the process, he's losing the knight here on d4. Rook takes d4, and queen to b8, trying to create a pin here and maybe pick up the bishop on c8. Rook back to d8, rook up to a8. The bishop still can't move because the rook on d8 would be hanging, and now bishop e5, pushing the queen away. Queen over to a7. Now you can trade queens and win more slowly, but Bronstein has a nice maneuver to finish things off immediately. White's king is very exposed over here. There are plenty of black pieces in position to attack. So Bronstein brings the queen into the attack with queen b4, and now queen back to f8. The queen is making a nice zigzag maneuver over to the king side. That's enough to win the game, and in fact, after bishop h3, queen h6, Zita resigned. If he tries to defend the bishop here on h3, the rook can invade on the d-file, among many other ideas that are enough to win the game, and it's just over. This is a beautiful, beautiful game from Bronstein. The tactical sequences here and the move rook takes a1 are really appealing, but what really stands out here is how this game, its sister game against Pachman and other games at the time by Bronstein and Boleslavsky and others, really launched an entire opening and modern way of playing to the forefront of chess. To see more of my favorite games of the 1940s, simply click on the playlist that is popping up on your screen as I speak.